You've arrived. The past welcomes you with open arms. Tonight, we drift back to a time when survival meant braving endless ice and following herds across frozen lands. Before we begin, if these stories help you rest, a like or subscribe would mean a lot. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It's always surreal to see people from Canada, Europe, or Brazil sharing the same moment across time zones. Now, get comfortable. I mean it. Fix your pillows. Pull your blanket close. This one's worth settling in for. Let the noise of today fade. Your eyes open not to glowing screens, but to a world buried beneath snow, where the wind cuts sharp and the horizon is endless white. It is 20,000 years ago, and this is where our story begins.
In a world utterly unlike our own, a world where immense sheets of ice smothered the land and the air itself seemed to bite into flesh, humanity faced one of its greatest trials. These were the Ice Ages, an age of merciless cold and haunting silence, where survival was not simply difficult, but a daily battle against extinction. The ground lay buried beneath layers of frozen earth. The sky hung low and grey, and every gust of wind carried shards of ice that pierced clothing and skin alike. Resources were few, comforts non-existent, and every step carried the weight of danger. Yet within this vast frozen wilderness, scattered groups of our ancestors clung to life, fragile as sparks in a storm. How did they endure such cruelty? Armed with little more than their courage, their ingenuity and their will to live. How did they learn to adapt to an environment that threatened them with starvation and death at every turn? This is the story of their struggle, their brilliance, and the resilience that defined the earliest chapters of human history. To understand their plight, we must first imagine the world they inhabited. Huge glaciers stretched for hundreds of miles, thick enough to swallow mountains and grind valleys beneath their crushing weight. These ice sheets reshaped continents, turning rivers into frozen highways and plains into tundra that seemed endless. Winters were not just seasons, they were eras unto themselves, lasting year after year with a cold so deep it seeped into bone. Summers, when they came at all, were brief and weak, melting only the outermost crust of snow before surrendering again to the relentless frost. The winds were savage, carrying icy pellets that stung the face and stripped away warmth, while the dim sky reflected the cold indifference of the earth below. Forests that we know today as lush and sprawling were scarce then. In their place spread barren tundra, dotted with moss, lichens and low shrubs clinging desperately to life. This fragile vegetation dictated which animals could survive, and thus which animals humans could hunt. Mighty creatures roamed the plains, woolly mammoths with their towering frames and shaggy coats, woolly rhinoceroses, herds of bison and ibex. All beasts both a lifeline and a deadly challenge for hunters. To kill such giants demanded extraordinary courage, cunning strategies, and flawless cooperation. It was not enough to be strong. Survival required intelligence, unity, and an almost instinctive understanding of the world around them. Even water itself was a struggle to find. Rivers and lakes froze solid, locking away their life-giving contents beneath thick shells of ice. To drink, humans melted snow painstakingly over fire or sought out rare springs that remained unfrozen. Every necessity, whether food, water or shelter, came only through effort, ingenuity and risk. Humanity at this time was not the master of the world, but a small and vulnerable part of it. forced to adapt or perish. Shelter was no luxury, it was life itself. To sleep in the open on those deadly nights was to invite the embrace of death. Caves, when they were found, were sanctuaries. Their stone walls offered protection from howling winds, and with fire crackling inside, they became havens of warmth and light against the infinite dark. Families huddled within, sharing stories, crafting tools, and holding fast to one another's presence as the blizzards raged outside. But caves were not everywhere, and the vast open plains offered little in the way of natural refuge. Here, necessity forced innovation. From the very creatures they hunted, humans drew not only nourishment but also the means to build. The bones of mammoths became the skeletons of homes, great frames anchored in the earth and covered with thick hides, stitched together by careful hands. Stones weighed down the coverings, keeping them firm against screaming winds, while the hides themselves became walls against the cold. These dwellings were not mere shelters, they were the centres of human life, workshops, hearths, and gathering places where existence was redefined. Around the fire, children learned, elders taught, and knowledge was passed from one fragile generation to the next. Fire itself was the beating heart of Ice Age survival. To us, it may seem simple, but in that age, fire was a miracle, a line drawn between life and death. To spark it required patience, skill, and memory passed down carefully. Flint struck against marcasite, or friction between wood, could produce a tiny ember, fragile, flickering, easily lost. Yet once coaxed into flame, it became salvation. Fire warmed shelters and bodies, cast away the blackness of night, and softened the terror of predators lurking beyond. It turned raw flesh into nourishing meals, made hides pliable for clothing, and dried wood and bone for tools. It even became a weapon in its own right, its glow keeping wolves, bears, and saber-toothed cats at bay. And around it, humans gathered not only for warmth, but for unity. In its glow, trust was built, stories were told, songs were sung, and a fragile sense of safety blossomed amid the silence of the ice. Fire was not just a tool, it was a symbol of endurance, a heartbeat of humanity in a world determined to erase it. But even with shelter and fire, survival required more. It required tools carved with patience and vision from stone, bone, and wood. Flint was chipped and split with precision into blades, spearheads, and scrapers, each one shaped with a knowledge that spoke of deep understanding of materials and purpose. Bone and ivory became sewing needles, fine and delicate yet essential for stitching hides into tight-fitting layered garments. With these needles, humans crafted clothing not simply draped around the body, but engineered against the cold, multi-layered, insulated, supple, and durable. The hides of mammoths, deer, wolves, and bears were transformed into coats, boots, and blankets, treated with fat, smoke, and even chewed by hand to make them resistant and flexible. Clothing was not an accessory. It was armour against a merciless climate, the difference between life and a frozen corpse on the plains. Hunting remained the greatest trial, a task that tested both body and spirit. Facing down mammoths or bison with nothing but spears was an act of breathtaking courage. No man or woman could do it alone. Success came only through unity, through coordinated effort and strategy. Hunters studied the rhythms of migration, the movements of the herds, the weakness of terrain. They learned to drive prey towards swamps, cliffs, or snow traps where the great beasts could be slowed and cornered. They crafted snares and pits, cunning devices to wound or halt the animals before striking the final blow. And when at last the creature fell, the work had only begun. Every part of its body was precious. The meat for food, the fat for fuel, the hide for clothing and shelter, the bones for tools, the tendons for stitching. Nothing was wasted, for waste meant death in a world that gave nothing easily. These hunts were not just physical struggles, but acts of imagination and discipline. They demanded planning, courage, and cooperation on a scale no other creature could achieve. It was in these moments, against the colossal beasts of the Ice Age, that humanity began to rise, not as the strongest animal nor the fastest, but as the most adaptable, the most resourceful, and the most determined. This was the essence of life in the Ice Age: to endure, to adapt, to innovate. The shelters, the fires, the tools, the hunts and the clothing all tell the story of a people shaped by an environment of unrelenting brutality. They lived in a frozen world of silence and storm, where every day carried the weight of danger, and every breath was a triumph over the odds. Yet they survived, and in surviving they laid the foundation of all that would follow. The Ice Ages were not just a chapter of hardship, they were a crucible in which humanity was forged, tempered by frost and bound together by the unyielding will to live. The clothes of Ice Age humans were not mere garments, they were lifelines, second skins forged in the crucible of necessity. Designed to resist the merciless bite of the cold, these clothes were crafted with care and genius. They were tightly secured at the wrists, ankles and neck, shutting out the creeping fingers of icy wind. Hats covered heads and ears, gloves enveloped hands, and thick insulated boots shielded feet from the frozen ground that could sap life with a single misstep. They were not simple hides thrown loosely over the body, but carefully layered outfits, often made of 2 or more furs, with the soft hair tucked inward to trap warmth. The mastery of such clothing was one of humanity's greatest triumphs during the Ice Age, for it allowed fragile bodies to withstand winters that could strip the flesh from bone and freeze rivers into silence. These clothes became a barrier between man and extinction, enabling him to walk the tundra, to hunt, to gather, and to protect the fragile promise of his children's survival against the unrelenting cold. But no matter how warm the body, the stomach still demanded its due. Securing food was a constant, grinding battle. Large hunts brought down vast quantities of meat, but that bounty carried with it a new problem: preservation. In a world without salt, without refrigeration, and without tools beyond stone, bone and fire, spoilage was a deadly enemy. Yet the ingenuity of Ice Age humans rose to meet the challenge. They turned the world itself into their storehouse. The frozen ground became their ally, preserving meat buried beneath snowdrift or entombed in frozen soil. They learned to slice flesh into thin strips, drying it in the brittle air until it was tough, lightweight, and long-lasting. Smoking over slow fires infused meat with protection against decay, filling shelters with a scent both harsh and comforting. These methods transformed fleeting meals into reserves that could carry groups across barren weeks when the land seemed empty. Food was not limited to great hunts alone. Though the tundra yielded little, it was never entirely barren. Women and children dug into the frozen earth for roots and tubers, gathered berries in the brief summers, and scouted for plants hidden beneath snow. Fishing provided another lifeline: hooks carved from bone, nets woven from sinew, all crafted to pull nourishment from the icy waters. Every animal brought down was used in its entirety. Marrow was sucked from bones, fat rendered for fuel, hides tanned for warmth, sinews stripped for thread. Even bones themselves were burned as fuel or shaped into tools. Nothing was wasted. Every mouthful of energy mattered in a land where just breathing against the cold demanded enormous calories. Food was stored with care, tucked into natural caches and caves, beneath snow or within the walls of shelters. This foresight was more than practicality. It was survival strategy, a silent agreement between generations that tomorrow must be secured as fiercely as today. But survival did not rest only on individual effort. Alone, a person was doomed. It was unity, social cohesion, that gave humanity its edge. Bands of 20 to 50 souls moved together across the frozen landscape, families bound by blood, survival, and necessity. Each member had a role that could not be spared. Hunters, often the men, though not always, tracked herds and faced down mammoths and bison. Women, children, and the elderly gathered, processed hides, prepared food, and crafted clothing and tools. The old, though weakened in body, became living libraries, guardians of memory, passing on the maps of rivers, the knowledge of plants, and the secrets of flint and fire. Every hand mattered. Every voice had value. This division of labour ensured that the group functioned as a single organism, resilient where the individual would falter. And these groups were not isolated islands of humanity. Across the frozen plains they encountered others, perhaps cautiously, perhaps with tension. They exchanged goods, tools, or knowledge. Seasonal meetings may have allowed them to share mates, ensuring genetic diversity. These networks, fragile but real, gave Ice Age societies a flexibility and strength that reached beyond their small numbers. Unity was survival, but connection was resilience. Together, humanity endured, yet survival was not only about flesh and bone, but spirit. In the darkness of caves, by the flicker of firelight, humans left behind more than tools and bones. They left art. On the walls of Lascaux in France, Altamira in Spain, and countless hidden caverns they painted. Mammoths, bison, ibex, horses, etched in ochre, charcoal and iron oxide, brushed with feathers, smeared with fingers, or even blown from the mouth in sprays of pigment. These animals leapt with movement, pulsed with life, captured with an observation so keen it speaks across millennia. Some caves bear handprints, stark and silent, human shadows pressed into eternity. These were not idle decorations. They may have been prayers, rituals of magic to guide hunts, or visual lessons for children to learn the shapes of prey. They were records, libraries, spiritual outpourings in a world where words could vanish but images endured. Small sculptures carved from bone and ivory, fertility figurines, animals, symbols, added to this creative expression. Portable art carried through migrations. Even amid hunger and danger, the human spirit found time to create, to dream, to reach beyond survival. This creativity was paired with another gift, language. Though no recordings remain, the very survival strategies of Ice Age humans prove its presence. Coordinating hunts of mammoths required not only hand signals but spoken plans, warnings, commands shouted across the snow. Teaching the young to make tools, to track herds, to distinguish food from poison, all required words. Around fires, stories were told, binding groups together, giving meaning to their struggle. Jokes, songs, and conversations turned shelters into homes. Gestures, mimicry, and shared drawings on cave walls added layers to this communication. Language was the invisible thread weaving humanity together, carrying memory across generations and binding each fragile band into a culture. And always there was movement. The frozen world demanded migration, for resources were fleeting. Mammoth herds wandered in search of pastures, and humans followed. They trudged across vast plains of snow, forded frozen rivers, and scaled hills weighted with ice. These journeys were not random. They were guided by memory, experience, and shared wisdom. Generations of knowledge became maps, charting water sources, sheltering caves, and hunting grounds. With every step, humans spread, little by little, across new lands. Endurance and will carried them forward, and in their slow migrations lay the seeds of humanity's expansion across the earth. The story of Ice Age humanity is not only one of cold and hunger, but of brilliance, resilience, and hope. Their clothes were armour, their shelters sanctuaries, their fires hearts beating against the dark. Their hunts were deadly risks turned into feasts. Their art spoke of belief, their language bound them, and their migrations carved paths that shaped the destiny of all who came after. Against the silence of snow and the endless howl of wind, they stood together and survived. The ability to migrate and adapt to new environments was not just a survival tactic during the Ice Age. It was the very cornerstone of humanity's existence. Migration was movement written into our bones, an instinct passed from parent to child like the breath of life itself. Across vast frozen continents, small bands of humans set out on silent journeys, their footprints pressing briefly into snow before vanishing under drifting winds. These treks were more than the search for food and shelter. They were pilgrimages of survival, steps that carried our species away from extinction and into continuity. Each migration was a gamble. Ahead lay the unknown, valleys hidden in shadow, rivers frozen into mirrors, beasts waiting in silence. But to remain still was death. To move was hope. And so they moved, season after season, year after year, generation after generation. These migrations became the threads that wove together humanity's great tapestry. They carved paths across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, eventually binding the world in invisible trails of endurance. They were not rushed flights of desperation, but long and steady marches that spanned lifetimes. Families walked with fire carried from one camp to the next, protecting embers in shells or hollowed bone, keeping the warmth of yesterday alive for tomorrow. With every migration, humans learned. They learned the contours of the land, the habits of herds, the rhythm of rivers, and the hiding places of edible roots. They learned to listen to the earth, to the animals, and to one another. These journeys ensured not only survival but the spread of humanity across the globe, laying the foundations for all civilizations yet to come. But survival was not only a matter of skill or culture, it was also written into the flesh. Human endurance during the Ice Age depended on intelligence and invention, yes, but beneath the skin, a quieter adaptation was at work. These were the transformations of biology itself, changes slow and silent, unfolding not in days or years, but across countless generations. They were not choices, not inventions of the hand, but evolutions of the body, subtle recalibrations that made us more resilient in the face of the cold. One of the most profound of these adaptations lay in the hidden engine of life, metabolism. In a world where the cold could kill as swiftly as hunger, the body's ability to generate and store energy became its shield. Our ancestors likely developed ways to store fat more effectively, building natural insulation beneath their skin, reserves of warmth and sustenance in times of scarcity. This fat was not mere weight. It was life condensed into a resource the body could call upon when hunts failed, or when storms trapped families in caves for weeks. Each calorie was a fortress, each layer of warmth a silent ally against the wind. Body shape too began to change in subtle ways. In colder climates, human groups tended towards shorter limbs and stockier builds, conserving heat by minimizing surface area. It was a principle written not by human hands but by nature itself. Compact bodies lose heat more slowly, keeping vital organs safe. Compare this to the leaner frames of humans in warmer lands, where long limbs and tall builds allowed heat to dissipate. Each shape, each curve, was a message from the environment, sculpting the human form for survival. But adaptation was not only visible in shape. Deep inside, the body developed silent mechanisms to preserve heat. Shivering, an involuntary tremor of muscle, became a furnace of warmth, burning precious calories to stave off death. Blood vessels narrowed in hands and feet, pulling heat inward to the chest, protecting the heart, lungs and brain. Fingers numbed, toes froze, the core endured. These involuntary processes were ancient guardians, reflexes written in the nervous system long before language was born. Even skin and hair may have carried echoes of adaptation. Sebum, the body's natural oil, may have shifted in its balance, protecting skin from the raw sting of icy wind. Hair density and thickness may have varied, offering some groups greater insulation against the cold. Though evidence from that era is scarce, fragments remain in the genes of populations today, reminders that adaptation is not only cultural, but genetic, carved into the double helix of life itself. These biological changes were slow, almost imperceptible, but their effects were profound. Unlike a spear, a shelter, or a fire, they could not be crafted in a day. They required centuries, millennia, lives upon lives stacked like stones in a cairn. They reveal a truth as silent as it is powerful, that humanity's survival strategy was not only in the tools of the hand but in the transformations of the body. Evolution itself became a companion in the struggle, moulding us to endure the frozen ages. Yet even the fiercest winter is not eternal. The Ice Age, for all its cruelty, was only a chapter in Earth's greater story. After tens of thousands of years of unrelenting cold, a slow, invisible change began. The climate shifted so subtly that no hunter or gatherer could have named it, yet so profoundly that it altered the course of life forever. The great glaciers, vast sheets of ice that had crushed valleys and carved mountains, began to retreat. Temperatures crept upward. Snow melted, rivers swelled, lakes spread across the land. Forests, long banished by the freeze, began to return, unfurling green leaves where once there had been only frost. The world transformed. With the warming came abundance, but also upheaval. Grasses gave way to trees, open tundras shrank, and with them the herds of great beasts that had once been humanity's sustenance. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, and giant deer dwindled. Some vanished entirely, slipping into extinction under the twin pressures of climate change and human hunting. Where once hunters had faced the towering shadow of mammoths, they now turned to smaller, swifter prey, deer, boar, rabbits. The strategies of survival had to change. Spears grew lighter, traps more intricate, and the search for food extended into rivers, lakes, and forests. For humans, adaptation was once again the path forward. With the disappearance of vast herds, Groups could no longer follow migrations endlessly across continents. Instead, they began to linger, to return to the same places season after season. Camps became semi-permanent. Families knew the bends of rivers, the groves of nut-bearing trees, the burrows of animals. Slowly, stability began to emerge from the endless movement of their ancestors. And in this stability lay the seed of something new. The gathering of wild grains, once a minor supplement to the hunt, became more deliberate. People began to notice that seeds fell, sprouted and grew again. They began to scatter them purposefully, to tend patches of land, to wait for harvest. The long experiment of agriculture had begun, not in a moment of invention, but in countless small acts of observation and patience. From this shift, from the fading of the Ice Age into the dawn of warmth, came the first whispers of farming, villages and civilization. The end of the Ice Age was not an ending, but a transformation. The cold had shaped humanity into survivors, resilient, inventive, communal, adaptive. The warmth would shape them into builders, farmers, dreamers of cities. The great glaciers had been both enemy and teacher, pressing humanity to its limits, carving into it a resilience so deep that it would echo across every future age. And so the Ice Age, in its farewell, left behind a legacy not of despair, but of endurance. It proved that humans could face the most merciless of environments, and not only endure but grow stronger. The footprints left in snow became paths across continents. The shelters built in caves became homes. The paintings etched on stone became culture. The slow pulse of adaptation in flesh and bone became evolution. And the human spirit, the will to survive, to adapt, to imagine, burned brighter than the fires that once lit the darkest nights of ice. This is not merely a chapter of prehistory, it is a mirror of the human spirit. The story of survival during the Ice Age is not buried in ancient caves or locked in frozen soil. It lives within us still, in our resilience, in our adaptability, in our endless capacity to endure. The glaciers have retreated, but their memory lingers. They remind us of who we are, a species forged in ice, tempered by struggle, and destined to endure. Sleep now. Let yourself sink deeper into that perfect relaxation. Your eyelids are heavy. So heavy it will take too much effort to open them now. Your limbs feel pleasantly weighted, impossible to move even if you wanted to, which you don't. You just want to drift all the way down into deep, restful sleep. That's it. Just let go completely. The day is done. The work is finished. Nothing more required of you now except to rest, to renew, to dream perhaps of different possibilities, different worlds. But for now, just sleep deep and peaceful, easy and calm. Sleep now. Sleep well, drifting deeper with each breath down and down into perfect, complete rest.